Hello. This is Addison Ford, MHW student at Grambling State University, Social Welfare Policy class. I'm here today to talk a little about the Older American Act of 1965. Man, what an act! What an act! Uh, this act was very so needed in the United States. Just to kind of give you a little background, a lot of elderly was being neglected, abused. Mainly, a lot of them just at that time, during that particular era, didn't have what they needed in place at the time they became elderly. So a lot of these issues began to come to the forefront, which was a good thing, even during the time of Franklin D. Roosevelt as well. Because even before this act was established, there were other acts being put in place. There were other things and programs being released and signed by the president as well. Even like the food stamp, uh, which was established around, I want to say around about 1939, if I'm not mistaken. But a lot of things led up to this particular act being established, which came out to be a good thing. So even currently, even in the U.S. population of adults, even over the ages of 60, is about 57 million. that's a lot of that's a lot of elderly. It is estimated that by the year of 2050, the population of the elderly, of individuals, the elderly individuals, 65 years or older, will increase by 120%, while growing from 40 million to more than 88 million. Man, that is a growing, significant number. But however, the older adults with lower incomes in the U.S. are only a small percentage. There are only a small percentage, about 9%, are receiving nutritional services, while many other low income elderly are not receiving these needed services at all. But the Older American Act of 1965 was designed to address the social services needs for older adults, for the elderly adults. Um, with this being said, it was also established to help the elderly adult remain independent in their homes. Yes, and communities. We all know that our elderly don't like to give up where they live, right? But the act was established, and the act itself began to establish what they call the AOA. And I'm going to tell you what that means. That means Administration on Aging, which was considered the major vehicle for promoting the delivery of social services to the aging population. Yes, this was a very key component. In this particular component was one of the connects for this act. But we all know the Social Worker Code of Ethics. It includes standards of advocacy and social justice for all. And I believe that as social workers planning to work with the older adults, the population should be better understood by us, right? Should be better understood in understanding the barriers that they're facing and just making sure that we are being an advocate and also making sure that they are getting the needed programs and services that are made available to them, right? So this ties right into what we do even as social workers, right? So we can better help serve our population and also just again being familiar with the experience and challenges of this population is vital to effectively assist the problem and to assist the population in order to advocate for change, right? So, with that being said, like I stated earlier, some things had already started even back in 1933, where there was a surplus of agriculture put in place by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Also, even in 1939, the Food Stamp Plan came in place, which was very impactful. But the idea of it, it shifted the outlook, of the poor and the unemployed, for the poor and the unemployed. And then in 1965, that's when we had the Older American Act of 1965, which was signed into law and was established specifically focusing towards older adults and their nutritional needs. Yes, and their nutritional needs. So that just goes on to say that in the United States, they recognize the growing need for home delivery meals for the elderly, those that were isolated, those that didn't have family members around anymore. Well, of course, a big one was also dealing with health care. We all know that the elderly, once they retire, sometimes they still can afford health care, things of that nature. So, with this act being put in place, it began to gain ground and to promote and to advocate for these individuals that they may have things that were put in place and already put in place because of this act, administration on aging, and so forth, so that the elderly individuals can receive what they need, you know. Uh, but also, just making sure that we understand that there was a framework here. The framework was also it was employed through a secondary review um, that explored the impact of this policy that it had on elderly adults and whether this policy can continue to provide needs as the older adult population grows. So that within itself is also was something that they had to consider, they had to think about, because remember, the elderly population has been, it's been said that it's going to grow by 2050. It's going to grow by leaps and boundaries. From 40 some million to 88 million. And so forth. But that was a frame that was the framework that was reviewed pertaining to even why this act was being put in place, and even our understanding when and why it was put in place during that time. All those time frames play a major role leading up until now. But also just understanding that the objective here to understand that the federal government, through providing funding to states so that these services can be delivered, making sure that they are impacting this population in a positively way. Because sometimes all those services are available, sometimes all those services are applied for, sometimes they're not delivered all the time. And that does happen at times. But this act was also to put in place to ensure that, so there are individuals that are responsible for delivering these services, and that there are other individuals within these agencies, within these services, are responsible for making sure that happens for those that are in need, right? Absolutely. So the objective here is understanding the nature and the scope of the issue, and understanding that even one out of every seven of elderly population even faces a threat, of hunger and and basically neglect or even abuse, or just basically just being isolated or going without, but those things play a key component. Also, just to kind of understand the analysis, of this policy, it was said that it has been a very effective but yet at times the lack of evaluating it at times is not there. It's not all the way there. But also, it has effects and impacts and so forth. Overall, the costs and the benefits of this particular policy. It has been said that this policy has increased funding over the past years. Yes, from 410 million in 2008 to 439 million in the year of 2012. That's a big jump because they realize now that the expectancy of life of elderly back then when it started uh, has begun to increase more so now among the elderly population. So the life expectancy wasn't considered as for the elderly population as far as longevity concerned, them living a long time. But now uh, that has changed. So guess what? Over the years, they realized they had to increase that funding because guess what? What they were putting out, it wasn't even possibly covering everybody that was in need that was considered of the elderly population, and so forth. So the cost and the benefit, just explaining that one reason that elderly adults do not receive access to nutritional services, sometimes due to funding, and also that the need of home delivery meals is far greater than the funding available. So it was far greater. 22% of agencies responding stated that they were unable to serve all clients who requested home delivery meals. In the United States, Senator Special Committee on Aging 2011 is the source of that. You know, so it was very strenuous, but there were some strengths to the policy. The strengths were, home delivered meals are often the very first in-home service in elderly adults receiving, and also helps elderly adults sustain as much independency as possible, right? With the attempt to provide nutritional service, maintaining their dignity and avoid their perception of stigma, that is often associated with participating in an assisting program. It aims to view the participant as consumers and to be mindful of the culture and religion factors as well. So it has some strengths to the policy. Challenges, even of this policy were that the United States Senator uh, determining the Title III nutritional service program, or having to meet the nutritional needs for certain target groups. Many additional older adults are not receiving services like they need to. So that was one of the challenges that I also discovered, pertaining to this act and pertaining to this policy once it was released and once it was passed down, and so forth. But just like I said, but just in general, we have to understand that the Older Americans Act of 1965 has had a positive influence on the lives of elderly citizens, cultivating the laws aiming by offering, that's the key thing, by offering the services and resources needed to keep them self sufficient, secured, and healthy. Older Americans now have access to these services that promote their self sufficiency, security, and well being thanks to this law. Until then, take care. Have a good one.